Hi everyone and welcome to this new video. So last time we have introduced the concept of data-driven programs and we have seen a few constructs or a few statements that help us to create these data-driven programs. For example, we have seen the if-then-else construct, we have seen the while, when, the do loop and the for next loops, and we also have been through the command select case. So in this video we are going to introduce a different concept, which is the concept of arrays, and we are going to see the main concept and all of this through many examples. In particular, we are going to introduce new commands, and the commands are dim, option base, data and read. And of course all of these will be done for one and multi-dimensional arrays. So as usual, I want to thank you guys for helping me and for encouraging me by subscribing on this channel and by sharing the videos with others or by leaving comments. I thank you very much for this. I am very grateful. So let's start now with this video. Let's start by discussing what an array is. Imagine that you have a list of, let's say, numbers. But these numbers are all related to the same concept. Let's say that those numbers are the scores of people that have been participating to a contest. So those numbers, you want to save them in your program, in your basic program, but you want to save them in a way that is very consistent. So for example, you would like to have them all the same name, but they have to be differentiated by an index. So in that case, you would use an array. So what is an array? An array would be, in this specific context, would be essentially a list of variables which have been ordered through the use of an index. So all of these might sound very abstract, so let's write a few things on the screen so that everything becomes clearer. So let's imagine that we have a contest, and this contest is 10 persons have participated to this contest. So we have essentially 10 results, 10 scores that we would like to save. So one way would be to do the following. I could call score 1 and say, let's suppose that these are numbers between 0 and 10. Let's say that the first contestant scored 5, and then the second one scored 6, and then the third one scored 7, and so on and so on. So of course we could go ahead like this and eventually have score 10, and score 10 would be a value. Let's suppose it is 2. But all of this means that we have to come up with 10 different names for 10 different variables. Could we have a different way to save all those scores, to store all those scores in the program? And there is a way. The way is by using essentially arrays. So an array would be something like this. It's a variable that has a name, but then it also has an index. So this means that we could do something like this. A score of 1 equals 5, score of 2 equals 6, and so on until we have a score of 10, which is equal to 2. And as you can see, this way of writing things in the code or in the program is definitely more elegant but also more practical than this way, because this way it's essentially 10 different variables that have 10 different names. Here essentially you have always the same name for all these variables, but they are just differentiated. So the name in common is always score, but they are then differentiated by this index. So this means that, for example, you could use a for next loop to go through all these scores. You don't need to use, let's say, score 1, score 2, and so on, which would become very, very complicated. So in other words, that's what we mean by array in very practical terms. And now we are going to see how to define in practice an array in BASIC and how to use them. Of course, before we can actually use an array in a basic program, we need to define the array. What do I mean by definition of an array? Well, the very first thing that one needs to do is to define the name of the array. So in our particular case before, in the previous example, we have defined an array which name was score, which made sense. The name was meaningful because we are storing scores of participants of a context. But what we have not actually defined is the dimension of the array. You don't want to use, let's say, too much memory for the arrays that you need to use in your computer. So if you have 10 let's say if you have 10 participants in your contest, you don't want to use the amount of memory that you would need to store, let's say, 100 different scores. You want to have enough memory to store 10 scores, but not one single score more than that. So in practice, you have to use a command in BASIC to do this, and the command is the following one. It's called dim. So you practically type dim, then you provide the name of the array, and then in parentheses here you define what is the dimension of the array. So in our particular case, the array was used to store 10 different scores of a context, so we define the array being a score of 10. So of course, if we needed way more memory, we could have done something like this, score of 100, for example. That would have worked as well, but there would be no need. As you can see here, it's the IDE is obviously complaining because you cannot define the same array twice with different dimensions, but you see the point. Of course, you don't need to define arrays that are too big if you need less memory, so you have to be careful how you define your arrays, but it's not very difficult once you understand what is the problem that you have at hand, what is the problem that you want to solve. It's usually very clear what the dimension of an array is going to be. Another interesting thing that we need to introduce here is also the concept of multidimensional array. So we could define, for example, another kind of score. Let's call them scores this time, so that there is a difference with the previous array. And let's say we have 10, let's say, participants, but now these 10 participants have been practically playing for 4 different days, and we want to store the score of 10 different participants over a period of 4 days. So one way to do this would be to define a multidimensional array, where essentially the first index would mean the score of let's say the participant, so participant 1, participant 2, and so on until participant 10. But then also the second index would define what is the day where we have saved that score for that particular participant. So it could be day 1, day 2, day 3, and day 4. So this is in practice an example of a multidimensional array. I'm not going to go way beyond that, but this is to explain that you can define a single or let's say one or multi-dimensional array in BASICs. This is very easy, and all of this is achieved through the command dim. Now, another important concept is the lower bound of an array. In practice here, when we are defining those arrays, essentially the index will always start from 1. So let's say that I want to print the first value of score. This would be score of 1, and I can go until score of 10, and this is what I have in the array. But there are languages where, or let's say there are interpreters of BASIC where it's not always clear what is the lower bound of the index you can use for an array here. Is it 0 or is it 1? So there is a command here that one can use that is very practical. At the beginning of your code, you can type option base 0 or 1, and essentially what you are going to get is that this means in practice you are setting the lower bound of your arrays. So if you set option base 0, essentially the first element of your array would be score of 0, but if you set here option base 1, then essentially this expression here is not going to work because the very first index that you can insert here is equal to 1. So this is very important for compatibility reasons with other basic interpreters, and it's very important always to remember from what is the lower bound of an array that you can use. Now that we know how to define an array, how can we populate this array with values? And there are different answers to this question. So let's see the first and the simplest one. Let's suppose that we have defined an array which is again called score, and we have 3 different elements to keep things very simple. And let's say that score 1 has, for example, the value 1, and score 2 has the value, for example, 5, and finally score 3 has the value 9. So this is a perfectly simple but valid way to populate an array with values. But there is a different way to do this, which is very relevant in terms of memory management, especially if you are running BASIC on an 8-bit machine. And this different way is based on the use of commands called data and read. So data essentially is a command to store data. So in our case the scores are 1, 5 and 9. So this is what we are going to store in data. And then we don't need this anymore. What we are going to do is we are going to use the command read to read every single value that we have here in this line, and then to populate the array score. Since we have 3 elements, we are going to create a for next loop that runs over 1, 2 and 3. And we are going to use the command read to read the values in the line data. And the way we are going to do this is like this. So we use the command read, and the command read starts to read in an ordered way every single value that you have here on this line. So it's going to read 1, and the second time is going to read 5, and the third time is going to read 9. And here we put the name of a variable so that the value that has been read is saved in the variable, in this particular case var. So now we can write the following command: score of I is equal var. In practice, what we mean here is that every time read has read something and has stored the value in var, essentially we assign the value that is stored in var to the ith element of the array score. And finally, since we want to see what happened, we want to print score of I just to make sure that everything is correct. So if we run this code, this is what actually happened. And as you can see on the screen, we have 1, 5 and 9, which are exactly the values that we wanted to store in the array score. So in practice, what the code has done is it has defined the array score with 3 elements, and then it has gone through this for loop here 3 times, and every time it has read a value from this line here. So the first time it's the value 1, and then it assigned to score of I, which is 1 in this particular case, the value that has been read, which is again 1, and then it prints the value of score of 1. Then I becomes 2, so it reads for the second time in the data that has been stored in data here, and this is the value 5, which is going to be assigned to the variable score of 2. equal var, and so on until we get to the end of the array. So of course this is a different way to store values in an array. This is a more sophisticated one. It might not sound very useful, but this becomes very relevant when you are dealing with a lot of data and you don't have a lot of memory. To make things more interesting, we are going to slightly change this program here. The very first thing we are going to do is we are going to remove this print here. We don't need it anymore, and we are going to keep the rest of the program here. But now what we are going to do is we are going to implement let's say a program that finds the minimum and the maximum of what is stored in the array. So of course for 3 elements this is no big deal, one can find it very quickly. But if you have, let's say, an array with 1,000 different elements, things can get out of hand very quickly. So let's put a remark here and say that we are computing the minimum, and the way we are going to do this is like this. We define a variable that we are going to call mini, and this variable mini is a very big number, so let's say it is 1,000,000. Now we go through every single element of the array, score, so in this particular case here we go from 1 to 3, and we add the if command here. So if mini is, let's say, bigger than score of I, then do something. And what it has to do is that it has to update the value of mini to the actual value of score, because score in this case is going to be smaller than mini. And we write an end if here to close properly the if command here. So if we now, after this loop, we print mini, this is what we are going to get. We are going to run this actually. So we write mini equals something, and then we practically write the value for mini. We should find the following value. I mean, since we have only 3 values here and we have 1, 5 and 9, if we run this we should obtain the value 1. So let's compile and see what we get. And as you can see, the answer is correct. Mini is equal 1. So can we do the same thing but find, for example, the maximum? The answer is of course yes. So let's change the remark here and let's change the value of the variables, but this is more or less the same thing. So practically we do this if maxi is smaller. So here we are going to use this trick. We define the initial value of maxi equal to a negative value. So now if maxi is smaller than score of I, then maxi has to be updated and equal to the actual value of score, which is score of I. And at the end, if we want to print this value, we should know more or less what we should get. So if we run this code, since the values here are only 1, 5 and 9, we should obtain that maxi is equal to 9. So let's see if this is the case. And of course the answer is correct and maxi is equal to 9. So you quickly realize through this very simple example that one can do very sophisticated things on arrays. Of course, if we have just a few elements in the array, there is no need to do anything. You could do everything by hand. But if you have a huge number of elements in an array, this becomes extremely interesting. In a similar way, we can do similar things for multidimensional arrays. So let's remove this program now, we don't need it anymore, and let's implement a different program where now a multidimensional array is involved. So let's suppose that we have 3 participants for a contest, and now this contest has been going through a period of 2 days. So we define now the score like this: score of 3 because we have 3 participants, and 2 because we have 2 days. and we define those values, so we populate the score array in a very simple way. So let's say that for day first we had the first contestant got a value that is equal to 2, and then on day second the same participant got the same value, or let's say the same score too. And then let's do the very same thing for every other contestant, and let's say that it went more or less like this. So I'm making these numbers up just to have an example to work with. So the third participant is going to have those one. I forgot the equal here, the IDE told me that, so as you can see, IDEs are always useful. And finally we define this other value. So now we have populated the multidimensional array. In this case this is a two-dimensional array with different values, and we would like to find the minimum score that has been performed during these 2 days. So how can we do this? Because now we are in the presence of an array that is two-dimensional. So the way we are going to do this is very similar to what we have done with single, or let's say with one-dimensional arrays. So first of all we are going to define a variable, let's call it mini, and we are going to assign a very big value to this variable. So let's say 1,000,000. And then we are going to use two nested for loops in the following way. The outer loop is going to be let's say the day, so it's going to be let's say the variable d that goes from 1 to 2, so we close this for loop like this. And then the inner loop is going to be the following one, let's call it I, and this goes from 1 to 3 because we have 3 different participants. And then we close the for loop so that the IDE does not complain. So now in this loop here, in this part that is empty, this is where we are going to insert the if command. So if now score of I and D is, let's say, smaller than mini, then we update mini and we assign it to the value, to the current value of score, which is in this case score of I and D. And we close the if command properly by using the command and if. So what the code is going to do, okay, before I explain this, we want to put one final command, which is, okay, mini is equal to something, so that we can see at the end of the code, the program, what happened. So if we now run this program, this is what is going to happen. The very first thing is we are going to have the definition of the array score, which is now a two-dimensional array, where the first index runs from 1 to 3 and the second index runs from 1 to 2. Then what the program is going to do is going to populate these values, and by the way, since there are not so many values, we can see that the minimum is going to be equal to 2, so if this program works, we should obtain that mini is equal to 2. And then once the array score has been populated, this is the part where we actually we look for the minimum. So the way we do this is that we assign a big value to mini, so that when we do this if command here, when we perform this if command here, essentially the very first time mini is going to be a very big number compared to any value that is stored in score. So essentially we are going to, in practice, we are going to update mini to the very first value of the very first element of the array. And then what the program is doing now is the following thing. We have two nested loops. So this means that we start from d equal 1 and I equal 1. So this is day first and this is the first participant. So we look for the minimum through the scores over today, or let's say we look for the minimum over the scores of the first day, because d is equal 1 for every participant. Then once we go out of this inner loop here, we update the value of d, so d now becomes 2, and again we look for the minimum value of the scores over every participant for day 2. So by doing this, we are capable of performing operations on an array, and in this particular case we can find the minimum. So let's run this program to see what happens. And as you can see, it says that minimum is equal to 2, so it did work. So this concludes this video for today. I thank you very much as usual. For the beginners, of course, I always recommend to go through tutorials to see more than what I have presented. But also, if you have questions, please do not hesitate. You can share those questions in the comment. It would be my pleasure to answer to them. Thank you very much for your attention.